Hi, I'm Caroline Leavitt. I am the co-founder of A Mighty Blaze, the book initiative that was begun when the pandemic first started to help readers who lost their tours, readers who are writers who are about to tour, readers, and of course, indie bookstores. I'm so thrilled today because we have one of my favorite writers on the planet, Meredith Hall. So welcome, Meredith. We
Thank you, Caroline.
You're welcome. I first encountered Meredith when a galley of her memoir, Without a Map, which is about teen pregnancy, came through my door, and I just fell in love with the writing. I gave it a rave review. I believe it was for the Boston Globe at the time, but I just remember thinking this is a writer to watch. And when I found out that she had written a novel, Beneficence, I got really, really excited, and I immediately asked for the galley and got it. And it's an even better, richer, deeper book, and it's also a novel. We were talking about this a little bit before we started. It's a deeply, deeply immersive novel. It's about a family whose life is turned upside down and they have to find their way back to some sort of stasis and to each other. So, Meredith Hall. Meredith Hall's memoir, Without a Map, was instantly recognized as a classic. It became a New York Times bestseller. It was named Best Book of the Year by Kirkus, who is usually notoriously nasty, and they loved it. And BookSense, which is now an Indie Next Pick, it was Elle's Reader's Pick of the Year. Meredith was a recipient of the 2004 Gift of Freedom Award from A Room of Her Own Foundation. Her work has appeared in 5 Points, Gettysburg Review, Kenyon Review, Southern Review, New York Times, and many others. So I want to read some of the praise for Beneficence beside my own, which says, wonderful book. Go and buy it instantly. And we also have a link to so you can buy the book. And also, please post your questions in the chat. So, Wall Street Journal says, as organically as it traveled to heartbreak. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Beneficent progresses to the place of wisdom that lies beyond it, where we learn that a home is part of the vast world of innocence and harm, not an island beyond it. Danny Shapiro calls it a modern American masterpiece. Richard Russo says if the word luminous didn't already exist, you'd have to invent it to describe Meredith Hall's radiant new novel, Beneficence. And one more from Washington Post. These voices from the past so clearly speak to our time, at a moment when many of us wonder whether we'll lose the things that we consider blessings. Beneficence is one book that echoes ancient and important rhythms. So, Meredith, I love the book, and I want to know, because I always feel that writers are somehow haunted into writing their books, that there almost is even some question that they need to write about to find the answer. What was haunting you? What was the question for you? And how did what you found out in finishing the book differ from what you might have expected?
Okay, there are a lot of questions in there. They're
I
good
know, I'm
questions.
sorry. I piled them
No,
on.
this is a wonderful. It's wonderful for a writer to be able to talk about this. How did I enter this story, and what was I looking for, and what did I find in that story? These are wonderful questions. So I went into this story. I had considered many, many characters and many storylines. This is my first novel. I always considered myself an essayist, and I had not written any fiction at all, and not even short stories. I'd never tried fiction. And I knew that I wanted to move away from memoir and said, well, I read a lot. How hard can this be? I know good literature, I know good fiction. And I went into it feeling quite confident and hopeful. The first surprise was that I had a very difficult time locating this story. Uh, Different options that came up, ideas that I had, felt too thin. They felt obvious to me. And I was looking for uh, characters who were involved in lives that were morally complex and that gave me trouble. I wanted to have trouble writing these characters. And when I settled on this story, I think that it did accomplish that. I think this is a morally complex story. And I went in initially. Tup is the primary, one of the primary characters. He's the father and the husband in this farm family. And I initially imagined Tup actually to be very much like my own father. I was estranged from my father my entire adult life. And I thought, well, Tup is going to be a man, something awful happens. And Tup is going to be a man who makes very selfish decisions and self-serving decisions in the face of this great tragedy. I want to know how he lives with that. What does he think? How does he explain the decisions that he makes that are so selfish? So I went into it believing that Tup was really going to be sort of my bad guy, and he was a familiar man to me, and I was going to write that bad guy, that man who fails in most ways. And oddly, when I sat down to write, a woman named Doris showed up, his wife, and she said, I'm going to be the first one to talk here. And I had not even gotten as far as imagining his wife or who she was, what she was named. But a woman came to me the first day I sat down to write, and she claimed the opening to the story. It turned out that I ended up writing it in 3 voices in rounds: Doris, Dodie, their at the time 10-year-old daughter when the story starts, and Tup. Throughout the book, they each have their voice. Doris was first, and she is so in love with her husband. She likes him so completely. She respects him. She trusts him. She knows him. And I had to start there saying, oh, Tup is not my father. He is not a man I know. He is not a bad guy. So who is he? I know he's going to make decisions that are very difficult. Perhaps we can say even cause great harm, but he tells us again and again in a kind of wailing way, but I am a good man. And I came to feel that he was a very good man.
I love this. This is like a class in writing for me. It's so astute, and I want to talk more about that because you were mentioning before we started the interview that one of the males who read the book said that he had problems with those moral choices, and you and I were talking about how people are really complex and that villains do not think of themselves as villains. And it's interesting that Doris did not see her husband as a villain, but saw him as such a very good man. So I would like it if you would talk a little bit about that, and if you see any differences in the way men read your book than women, and how things are changing, and just talk.
Well, it's interesting. I would actually think that many women would watch Tup, come to know him, and feel uncomfortable. Tup in the end, he's able to reclaim what he compromised, and they return to that life. He and Doris both say at the very end of this book, we've changed. We've changed. Both of us have changed, and our world has changed. But they are still able to claim their profound love and trust in each other. And I think that's because Doris fails in her own way. After this incident, Doris retreats. This book starts in 1947. This event happened in that year. And I think now, there was no language for it at the time. Now we would say that grief drove Doris into a very profound and prolonged depression. And that depression pulled her out of her family life. She really was a shell in her family for a very long time. And she clearly and absolutely failed her own children. At one point, she says to us, I cared too much about my own grief, and it left her children adrift. And so Doris has failed too. I think that my sense is that Tup loved his wife so much that withdrawal from him is what forced him away and into these other decisions that he made. So that's my understanding of the motivations of these people. They came back to each other, I think, ultimately acknowledging their human failings, acknowledging each to the other. I failed. I am a human being. I didn't do what I needed to do, and I caused harm. And it's because they each recognize that and accept that and can bring that to each other with a hope for moving through that, carrying it with them forever, but moving through it to something better. So I think that in the end, these characters themselves are asking us to see them as flawed, but not bad people.
No, they are not.
Like
They're
me, right?
they're incredibly human, which is what I really loved about the book. There are no lines of black and white, this is right and this is not. They're deeply human and alive and changing. You were also talking to our producer, Julie, and I before this interview about how you were thinking about writing a sequel. And I remember what you were talking about, and I actually said to you, oh, you have to talk about that in the interview because it's so interesting. So please talk about that for us now. Why a sequel?
Readers may already have found, readers who haven't read this book yet will meet three children in this story. The oldest, Sunny, the middle child, Dodie, who has a voice, and the youngest child, Beston, a little boy. Sunny and Beston are not given a voice in this story. They live on a farm, a very prosperous farm in Maine, in the middle of the 1900s, 1950s into the 1960s. It's a very, very beautiful place. And both its beauty and productivity and also the work required to run this farm bind this family together. So this little boy, Beston, although he doesn't have a voice, is very central to this universe on the farm. In the end, because we have never, he's in his teens, later teens at the end of the story, and because we've heard about him, his sister Dodie, who tells so much of this story, reports him to us and explains him to us, but we don't hear him, and that is very interesting to me. I'm very interested in this very beautiful, very talented, but really almost silent boy. Silent in the story, not just for readers, but he's a very quiet boy. And there's a child, Grace, who appears, and she really is an invisible child and at risk of being invisible into the future. And she's just a little girl when we leave this story. And I'm interested in both of them. I would like to meet them. I don't know them very well yet, and I would like to meet both of them. I think that when we were talking about this, I said that so far I have not been able to pull together that morally complex story about a very little girl who is not yet living in the world and a boy, a young boy, who has lived so silently and so well. He's a very, very good boy. And
that's fascinating.
But I laughed with you, Caroline, that I can't imagine. This was my first novel. It's unimaginable to me that I'm going to be a writer that returns and writes a sequel to this. But I find that these characters have stayed with me, and I want to know more about them. So that's what I'm circling right now.
For a first novelist, you've produced something that akin to a masterwork, according to many critics and to myself. So I want to know, how scary was it for you to move from memoir to novel?
I was actually I didn't feel very intimidated by it. I should have. I should have felt much more intimidated than I did feel. I was grateful to move away from the memoir. And it took me several years to sort of tumble to this story. And that time in between, I felt that I felt that it was, I started to really recognize how different essay writing, nonfiction writing is.
Oh.
I'm a creative nonfiction writer. I'm a narrative nonfiction writer. And I thought, well, truth or made up, it's still narrative writing. And I actually felt confident. Once I started writing, I felt absolutely confident in what I was doing. I wobbled for several years before I entered this book, not being able to claim increasingly, I became uncertain of my ability to claim made up stories on the page. What I discovered is I'm an episodic writer. If you look at the pages of this book, there's a double space every 2 pages, every 3 or 4 pages, and then I'm on to something else. And my memoir is structured this way too. It's an unconscious move on my part. It's the way my brain works. I tell multiple stories, and they accrue into this larger whole. And I have no problem at all coming up with those episodes. There could be thousands of them in this book. Everything is possible for a fiction writer. And I did discover that my imagination is absolutely up to this task.
Oh,
That
that's
is
so
not the
great.
problem. Yeah, that's not the problem. I love making story. And my friends tease me often, saying in frustration, Meredith, I can't ask you the simplest question about what you did yesterday afternoon without you breaking up into some long story. So story making, I think, is intuitive for us. I think that it's how human beings throughout time have understood the world and conveyed it to each other. You know, if you and I sat down over tea this afternoon, I think it would take us about 4 minutes for one or the other of us to get to. Once when I was living in Denver, I knew a person who, and on you'd go, right? So
Right.
I believe in storytelling, and once I had my story, this larger story about what happens to the Center family, once I had an understanding of where I was going to start, then I was able to move into that fiction and away from memoir.
I want to say that Jill Swenson, thank you for responding to us. Jill said, thanks for the question about talking about from memoir to fiction. All the rest of you, if you have questions, post them in the chat. But I also wanted to ask you, Meredith, do you also find, as far as this love of story, that even when you're telling a true story, you can't help yourself from embellishing some of the details? Because that certainly happens with me.
So, I think because I taught memoir writing to graduate students for many years, I feel quite old-fashioned about this. I think that if it's true, it's true, and if it's made up, it's made up. And
Oh,
unless the writer signals us on the page very clearly that she is moving between made up story and real, I think that I personally think you need to stick to the facts. I had a very
no.
interesting experience with, sorry, Caroline. I had a very
Audra.
interesting experience with my memoir, with Without a Map. In
Right.
it, I tell the story. I'm a pregnant 16-year-old girl. My mother has kicked me out. My father and a truly evil stepmother have allowed me to come and stay with them for the last 4 months of my pregnancy once it was discovered. And this woman, my stepmother, out of the blue, tells me to dress in the morning. She was very harsh. Get dressed in the morning. And I got dressed, and she put me in the car, and we drove to Logan Airport in Boston, and she put me on a plane. We landed in New York, had no idea what we were doing. She took me to her corporate office building and sat me in the lobby for hours. And then at one point in the afternoon, she retrieved me and took me to an absolutely beautiful, magnificent theater, a live theater. And I had never seen anything like it. I don't know what theater it was, but it absolutely, for this small town New Hampshire girl, it was impressive. And I watched Sir Laurence Olivier stride that stage in Othello, and I was permanently changed. It is one of the great and transformative experiences of my life. I had never imagined such a thing. And his story of betrayal and loss just resonated so deeply for me. When my paperback came out of the memoir, I mentioned to Charles Simic, who is a great poet. He and I were colleagues at the University of New Hampshire. And I mentioned to Charlie that I was having trouble because I wanted everything to be true. Everything had to be, I wanted to try to verify everything. And I had not been able to verify the theater. Where did Sir Laurence Olivier do that in the spring of 1966? And Charlie, who is very, very well educated in the arts, laughed and said, "You didn't see him live. His film of Othello came out that spring. You saw a movie, and it was so confusing to me because I had seen live people on that stage.
Right.
And so I went back to Helen Atwan, my editor at Beacon, and we wrestled with this, how to handle it. I said, if I change this, I'm going to be making up a story. It will be fiction. If I make it true, it will be fiction. If I leave it the way it is true, but it never happened. And I love that dilemma. For me, that's really illustrative of what can happen for memoir writers. And I've been asked, so what did you decide? I once in a while go back and then I forget. I believe we left it. I think Helen said, for you, it is true that you saw this live play. And I believe that was her vote in the end.
That's so fascinating. That's so completely fascinating. Now I'm going to have to rethink my relationship with truth.
I'm so sorry, Caroline.
I want to talk about the dairy farm. I always say that setting is not really just setting. It's more, I like to call it story world, where I feel like the backdrop is always a character in itself, which I feel like the whole details about the dairy farm that this family operates were so vivid and so, they changed as the characters changed, just as where we live changes according to what is going on in our life. So I would like to know, why did you choose to set it in a dairy farm? Did you know all the details? Did you have to do details? What surprised you about the details? And I just know that whatever you're going to say about it is going to be fascinating. So I'm just going to sit here and listen.
Well, I have a couple answers to this.
Okay.
One is, I don't know anything at all about dairy farms. I never lived on a dairy farm. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, and my sister and I kept 4-H sheep in our garage. We had pens in the garage, and she had a horse, and we lived in a neighborhood that had goats and ponies and horses. When I moved back to Maine, I lived in a world, this was in the 70s, and young people, thronged to Maine to reestablish farms. And the farm communities and the new young people were very well integrated. And so I think in those towns, everybody is aware of the farms. We know the farms, we watch them, we're aware of the people. And so I knew them to that degree. I think I chose this dairy farm because it is a life that I have always wanted. This is my dream life, living in a very beautiful piece of Maine land, and perhaps not running a large dairy farm, but keeping animals and doing that daily work, the rhythm of that daily work. So for me, this is real. It's a kind of dream world. You use that word. It's a dream world for me that has such reality. It was not difficult at all. I see the kitchen, I see the children's bedrooms, and I see the big window with the thin curtains that blow in the wind in Tuff and Doris's bedroom. The tub in the shed where the family bathes next to the kitchen. This is all the barn, the lights on, the lamps on, left on in the barn, the radio playing low. This is all somehow as if I have lived this life. I did very little research.
I love it.
Very, very little research. It somehow was there. There were certain technical things I needed to know. I have castrated and docked lambs. I didn't know if it went the same way for cows and cattle. And so I had to research that. When does a farmer put manure on his fields? What month does that happen? But cutting and tedding the hay, I can hear that tedder. I know what it sounds like. I never I know what it sounds like. So it's a strange thing. I don't have a wonderful, clear answer to it. I created, when my agent first read my manuscript, I was thrilled because she said, she called me immediately after finishing it and said, I feel as if I've been in an alternate universe. And that's just how it felt for me every day. It was a coming home for me. It was a return to a place that I longed for with everything in me. And I miss it very, very badly now that I'm not in it.
That's magic. That's magic. I want to ask about the structure of the book. You didn't describe this tragedy as much as show its impact before it happened and then the aftermath. What I thought that was a brilliant decision, but I wanted to know what made you decide that. Do you know the structure when you start, or does it reveal itself to you?
Yes, no, I made no decisions. This is one of the places where my naivete and lack of experience in writing fiction really is evident to me. I wrote these stories in first person for each of these three speakers, um, and I think that was because I had written a memoir. I'd never made a decision. Decisions now, as I move into a second novel, I'm looking at questions about structure that I never considered with this book. I didn't know I needed to. I didn't understand that I had to make decisions. And so these things happened very intuitively. I wrote in first person, I think because I had written a memoir and I didn't know any other way to write. And I wrote in multiple voices because I feel I'm very attracted to the intimacy of a person
Right.
telling his or her own story. And then I limited the voices. I decided those are the three voices that will be here. So that was a structural decision that I made. I also started back in a time which is that sort of romantic time of running a dairy farm in in Maine,
I love
in
it.
which um, in which the land is beautiful and the farm is working. And I decided that 1947 was that was a good time to run this farm. And so I made the decision about that. But I did make one very clear decision because of the three voices and the book moving from 1947. I truly didn't know how far forward we would go. I didn't know whether I would stop as soon as this tragedy hits this family. Maybe that was the end of the book. I didn't know how I was going to deal with that. But I knew it was going to move forward, and I wanted to be very explicit about where we were in time. So the segments are actually, it's in four parts: before, during, after, and here at the end. And I actually give the date of each of those Doris, Dodie, Tup rounds of telling the story. I'm very clear saying, now this is 1951, now this is 1954. I wanted readers not to have to struggle with questions. They already had a fairly complex structure, and I didn't want them to struggle with where we are. So those were the decisions I made. Beyond that, it was me walking blindly into my first novel.
So we have another question, which is, did you read any farm memoirs before you started writing? Classics like We Take to the Woods or the Nearings books. How did you, I'm
I
just,
should say yes. I should say I read them all, and they informed my writing. I didn't read any. No, I didn't. I
do
didn't.
you, did you show your pages as you're working to anybody? Do you have a writer's
No,
group? Or,
no. I'm
wow.
an intensely private writer. So the first person who saw my work after, I don't know, I actually wrote. I started writing, and probably got into that classic 60 or 70 page range and got stuck as I tried to see where I was going. I think in the end, once I hit page 70 and thought about it, I think I wrote the rest of the book in 6 months, but I took a couple of years to get that far. And
Wow.
and I I didn't show during all of that time, during those several years. Nobody saw this book. Nobody saw any part of the book. Nobody knew really what I was writing about. Family and friends knew that it was a story that took place on a farm and a tragedy hit the family. That's all they knew. So the first person ever to lay eyes on my book was my agent. And so it was a very apprehensive moment, as you can imagine.
Wow.
I had never had any conversations or feedback about what I was writing. I seemed to have a tremendous need to write separate from the world. I listen to Gregorian chants when I write. I turn them on
That's
at the very
hypnotic. That's perfect.
moment of writing, and they are on throughout the writing. If I get up and leave my writing room to make tea, they go off. I don't want to hear them in the background as I do any real thing in the world. And then I come back in and I put them on, and they carry me. And I somehow seem to have trained my brain. It's literally a switch, and I shoot down that tunnel into that faraway world. I'm gone. And I think it would be very confusing to me to have anybody interacting with what's on the page. It would be very, very overwhelming and confusing for me.
I think you're exactly right, because everybody has a different opinion. And I can remember when I just turned in a book to my agent, I showed it to another writer, and she called me up and she said, Caroline, some writers need to burn certain books. I think this issue needs to burn. And I was decimated. And I called my agent up and said, I think I need to take this book back. And she said, why? It's really good. And it went on to be published. I was fine. And the interesting thing is, the writer who thought I should burn it, she never changed her opinion. But I think you can trust yourself.
It's a complicated story. I'm not sure that was, that's a complicated story. It demonstrates, though, how vulnerable we are to those outside voices. Had this woman showed up when you were on chapter 5, what would have happened to you?
I would have freaked out. I mean, I think I would have stopped writing. I would have had tears. Now I've learned that, you listen to what people say if you are going to show it, and then you have to listen to yourself. You have to go deeper and listen to your gut and see what's going on.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yes, maybe as I gain some more experience as a fiction writer, I will decide that other people.
No, you're doing fine without that.
I taught writing all those years, organizing my graduate students into pairs of readers, and those pairs changed through the year. And I strongly encourage them to form reading groups outside the class that they would stay with through their 3 years in the program. And then when they left the program, for them to be certain to find and maintain good reading groups, writing groups, so that they had deadlines and people were waiting for their work, and they had feedback on their work. And it is unimaginable to me. I can't imagine doing that myself. But I think it's good advice. I think it's a good way to write. I believe in it. But I don't know what it is about me. I'm a very, very private person. And
I think that's great. I think that's great. I think it's great that you have the bravery to be like that, because it's so easy to be buffeted by other people's opinions. I want to talk about I want to talk about how you handled depression in the novel, which was extraordinary to me. Again, the same basic questions. Where did how you wrote about depression come from? What surprised you about it as you were writing it? That seems to be a theme here. I'm always interested in, because I'm sure you know that as you're writing about something, things come up that you don't expect to come up. So please talk about depression in the novel.
So that was the most challenging. Writing Doris was the most challenging part of this book for me. I have never experienced depression, certainly no deep or lasting depression.
You got it right.
We all go through moments, of course, brief times in our lives. But I don't, this is a world I don't know anything about. I feel very, very blessed that I happen to get genes that don't bring this to me. So she was mysterious to me. I don't think that I considered it depression as I wrote her. It's only been afterwards that I thought, oh, now we would call that, sort of not a postpartum, but a post-trauma, post-loss kind of depression for a mother. And instead, I thought of it, there's a wonderful Maine expression when it's used only for women in my experience. I've never heard this used about men. If a woman has a terrible blow in her life and experiences some mental health issues, the old timers will say, well, she went into herself, she went into herself. So that was the language that I had in my mind as I wrote Doris. So the challenge for me was, what does it look like when a woman goes into herself from trauma?
Right.
And I had to imagine that. I didn't know. I had to find, and I thought, well, does the language change? At one point, Doris falls for a fairly long period of time. She falls into a speech pattern where a word triggers other words like it, and she can't stop herself. So she might say, beneficence comes up in one of those lists of beneficence, beatitudes, benefits, and she goes into a long string of those BEN words, and Tup has to occasionally call her back, Doris, gently, Doris, to stop her. So in a sense, literally, she had gone into herself and was in a clear way demonstrating that struggle. But more than that, she exited. She really left, and she does her circuits out in the yard between the house and the barn at night. She walks her endless circuits, and it was me struggling to imagine what she would be feeling and what she would be able to pull off in the family and what she would not be able to pull off in the family. So I think probably being a mother, and that informed it a lot, trying to imagine what happens when something terrible happens like this, something awful. So it was hard. It was really hard. It felt important to me. I wanted to get it right because I know that other readers have experienced this kind of loss and know that state. And I felt very burdened by getting it right. So.
I have 2 more questions coming up, and one of them is a perennial favorite of mine, which is, what's obsessing you right now, Meredith, and why?
What's obsessing me? Is that your question?
Yeah.
I think what is obsessing me is this idea of what loyalty and honesty, integrity, what they entail, and what the costs are when those are lost. I think that it's that same territory of good people failing in significant ways, and I circle it and circle it. I find a lot of the ideas that I come up with for fiction really have a kind of they spin down to that element, and I realize that it's something that I do focus on. I also think that loss is it's prevalent in my own life. That is certainly something when I wrote Beneficence, I had zero idea that I was writing anything about my life. I thought I was escaping memoir, and I was writing a book about the outside world, completely outside me. And it was only when I was probably 3/4 of the way done, I found that the grief of this family was so overwhelming for me. I carried it with me all day, every day. I was intensely inside this writing and couldn't get outside it. I couldn't leave it. I was always in it, day after day and through the night. And I would wake in the night or take a shower and cry over the griefs of this family. And I thought, well, that's good. You really have hit
it. Is good.
This is good. You're living their grief. That's good. It was only very late in the book. I literally, it was a comical moment, I think, when I sat upright in the dark in my bed and said, oh my God, I am writing a sorrow that I know. The loss of a child. I know this. I know this sorrow. Here I am again writing my story. It looks different. It sounds different. I don't know these people. I'm learning these people, but I am writing a story that I know. So I suspect that knowledge of loss is there. I think it's familiar. Not just the loss of the child. I lost my mother and father as a result of the pregnancy. I lost my sister and brother. And so I think that loss inevitably and the sorrows that it brings, that's inevitably going to be in my stories. I was laughing with a writer friend, Lily Brooks Dalton, yesterday on the telephone, and I was laughing. She was asking what I was up to. And I said, I don't know. Am I doomed to always write sorrow and move away from this?
That's actually a brilliant interpretation of what it is that writers do. I mean, writers are always careful to say, this isn't autobiographical, but the feelings in a novel always are autobiographical, usually.
Yeah, I learned that. Yes, I've learned that.
They absolutely are. And another perennial favorite question, what question didn't I ask you that I should be mortified that I forgot to ask?
Oh, that's a good question. So one of the things that that people are readers have been very interested in is that this family lives essentially on an island. They live on a long dirt road far from town. The dirt road extends beyond their farm, but only ends up in their neighbors' fields. It doesn't go anywhere. And this family, when we meet them, is they are very well integrated with each other. This is not a lonely family. These people are very well integrated as a family. And they're well integrated in that 1940s, 1950s world with their small farming community. They go to church every Sunday, and that church community is very important to them. It's a small local Protestant church, and they go to suppers there, and they go to harvest fairs at the church. And this is a very important part of their lives. They carry a basic, very New England country faith. I don't think that they are involved in the ideology of the church at all. They believe in God. They believe in goodness. They believe in forgiveness, the forgiveness of God. They believe in heaven. They believe there is an afterlife. And I think that's about it. That is their religious life. The church is their primary point of integration in the village, and it keeps them tied to their neighbors. This is the place that joins neighbors. And I think that what happens with this family when this implosion inside the family occurs, they withdraw from that community entirely. They disappear. And it leaves them in a terribly isolated world on that farm. In the end, they do return to that village life. And they are very surprised the first time all of them return, and they are visible together. They're, I think, quite shocked. Doris especially is quite shocked that in spite of Tup's decisions in his life that have been so costly and are so morally complex, and her failures as a mother, as she tolerated and accepted her own absence from her children and her husband. In spite of that, the village people, the people in this church, are not bringing those judgments to them. And I think that was quite a revelation for them, that they could misstep in these terrible ways, but these good and decent people, these ordinary people in this village, see them as potentially themselves. I too might have made these decisions under these circumstances. So I'm very interested in that. I didn't understand. I didn't know that the people, these casual but old friends and cohorts in this town would come to them with such an understanding of human frailty.
It's wonderful. I cannot tell you. I could talk to you for another 2 hours. I want to tell everybody out there, trust me, Beneficence is one of the most magnificent novels I've read this year. We have a link for it. Go to your local indie and buy it. Buy it as gifts for friends. Meredith, you're welcome back here anytime you want. I would talk to you about paint drying because I think you could make it fascinating.
I would talk with you about anything. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation to A Mighty Blaze. Thank you, Mighty Blaze. Thank you, Julie, for all your amazing work as a non-techie. I'm pulling off all the technology. And I truly feel honored. I feel very grateful that we've had this time together. So thank you.
You're welcome. I also want to thank our brilliant producer, Julie Gerstenblatt, for, just doing a great job producing. She's an amazing person, and so are you, Meredith. And so is everybody who came to watch this interview. It will be live forever on our YouTube station. And thank you all so much for showing up, and we'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.